as you just heard, I'm going to be speaking about the stages of the spiritual path. And I'll be doing that as well. I'll be taking that out of the context of one of the papers which have been published in this book, which you'll find on sale up in the bookshop. This is not an advertisement, by the way. Just to let you know where I'm taking my material from. It's taken from one of these papers entitled Initiation into a New Life. And so that's what I'm going to try to do this evening, is tell you about, or talk to you about the stages of the spiritual path. And as usual, I'm going to wind my way into it gradually, so please bear with me. It may seem as if I'm talking about something completely irrelevant, but I hope that you will find out that that's not the case. So what I want you to do to start with is imagine an evening just like this. That's not difficult, is it? Except that it's 44 years ago. It's 1972. And we are not in Bethnal Green, but in distant North London, not far from Highgate Cemetery. And around in this area, there are various streets full of houses which have been boarded up because they were due for refurbishment, council houses. So again, imagine 5 young men climbing over the back wall of one of these houses, taking off the corrugated sheeting from the doors and the windows and gleefully climbing in through the kitchen window into the house, and then camping there for the night, carefully making sure that they changed the locks before the morning. 5 young desperados, one of whom was me. And this is how we set up our first communities around the very first Tree-Ratner centre in North London, way back in 72. There were a number of communities surrounding our centre in Archway in those days, and they were all squats. You know, we'd set them up by just simply forcing our way into these unoccupied council houses, because we knew that, lots of people were doing it. It wasn't illegal, and once you were in, you were secure. You just had to make sure that you changed the locks. That was the most important thing, so that the council people couldn't get in and throw you out. Anyway, that was how my first community came into existence. I was a squatter. And many of us were squatters. Most of us were squatters in those early days, and we all lived in similar houses around our centre. The community that I helped establish was the first ever men's community. All the other communities, that was an accident, by the way. We didn't think like that. It's just that 5 men came together and we set up this community together. All the other communities had both men and women in them. And these communities survived for quite some time. And gradually, out of these communities, more and more of us many of us became order members. We got ordained fairly quickly, and we started to assume responsibility for the classes that were being run at the centre, and eventually for the running of the movement, of which you are the beneficiaries now here in Bethnal Green, but not just you here, people all over the world. But we were on a steep learning curve. For a start, we knew very little about Buddhism in those days. We were just eagerly awaiting each new lecture from Sangharakshita as he announced yet another lecture series. There was only 2 books available to read. There was a Survey of Buddhism and the 3 Jewels. They're the only books that he had published in those days. So we didn't have an awful lot of material, but we did have him, and he kept an eagle eye upon us. And he was so sharp. I mean, he moved away from London, spent some time in Cornwall, and then moved to Norfolk after that. But he used to scrutinise very carefully the minutes of the council meetings that was running the centre. And one thing became a bit legendary in this particular matter. He noticed that over a period of meetings, which extended not just over weeks but months, the same item kept coming back up, and that was I can't remember. It was something like this. It was a maintenance item, basically. There was a lock needed to be put on some window or other. I can't remember precisely what it was now. Something of that sort, anyway. And someone agreed to do it the first time it was brought up. And the next council meeting, it hadn't been done. And the next one, and the next one, and the next one. It went on for months. And, of course, it came to his attention. And he commented upon it, and he commented upon it a number of times in subsequent years, because this was part of our training. We had to learn that if you say you're going to do something, then you do it. There were lots of similar instances to this, but this was the sort of legendary one, the one that he liked to joke about and recount many years later. I do believe that eventually the item got attended to, but I'm not absolutely sure. I wasn't living in Archway when this all happened. I'd moved on to other pastures by that time. But the reason I'm telling you this story is because it was part of my training, part of our training back in those days, if you like, of traversing the first of the stages of the spiritual path, which Sangharakshita has cast in terms of the stage of integration. So I'll come back to what I just said a little later on, but I just want to enumerate what these 5 stages are. Now, it's not something that he's just invented out of thin air. I mean, it has its basis in tradition. There's a teaching within the Mahayana tradition of Buddhism called the 5 chief paths. So Sangharakshita recast his teaching in his own way, keeping very much the spirit of these stages as traditionally taught, but in a way making them a bit more accessible for us, helping us to make it a bit more clear what it was that we were supposed to be doing now that we were Buddhists, because we were the beginners. We were the beginnings of this movement. There weren't sort of scores of order members around every centre, as there seems to be these days. There was just a bunch of people who were mostly ex-hippies or hippies of one persuasion or another, people who'd been into drugs, even dealt in drugs, all that sort of thing, and 1 or 2 professional people like myself. Desperado though I was a professional actor still. I was still working. I was a working actor. I was a professional. Some of the others were, not all of them were. Yes. We had all dropped out in one way or another. But we had to learn some pretty basic things. We didn't have other order members, experienced order members, from whose experience we could learn and benefit. That was yet in the future. And we became that first batch of order members who were regarded as senior and experienced. So, yes, one of the first things that we had to learn was that if we committed ourselves to doing something, then we should follow that through. We should actually do that. And Sangharakshita really would hold you to this. I've worked very closely with him throughout the course of my life, and holding a responsibility, a major responsibility, as I did for many years within the context of the movement. He certainly made sure that I fulfilled my responsibilities. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself there. But yes, this first stage is a stage of integration. And what that means is we begin to we begin to develop awareness of who we are. Become more acquainted with ourselves through the practice of mindfulness, especially through the practice of the mindfulness of breathing and meditation generally, especially. But more than that, we don't just become aware of ourselves. We begin to take responsibility for who we are and act in accordance with ethical precepts. So in other words, we take responsibility for ourselves as moral beings. And that's essentially what this first stage is all about. So we assume responsibility for ourselves. So if you say you're going to do something, then you do it. Now this is important because If you don't do it, if you say you're going to do something and then you just don't, because at a later stage it becomes inconvenient, or you forget, or you can't be bothered, or whatever it is, it implies a lack of integration, a lack of psychological integration. This is why it's so important that we learn to do what we say we're going to do. If you're not able to do that thing, and you know that you're not able to do it or not likely to do it, far better just to say, sorry, find somebody else. That way at least you're taking responsibility for yourself. But if you agree to do something and then don't do it, for whatever reason, unless it's a really, really good reason, and usually there isn't, but if there was, well, that might be different. But by and large, if you say you're going to do something, then you should do it. This is what he really tried to drum hard into us in those early days. And I, for one, am very grateful that he did, because it's such a mundane thing, but actually it helps you it gives you a practice, if you like, which helps you to bring about a greater degree of psychological integration, a greater degree of self-awareness. Because one of the reasons why we agree to do things and then don't do them is because we're not really fully aware of ourselves. Part of us wants to do that thing, perhaps, or perhaps we want to do it for not very positive reasons, but those can't hold. They're not sufficient motives to get us to do it in the end. So by only agreeing to do things that you know you are going to do and will do, that's one way you can train yourself, one way you can help to bring about a greater degree of psychological integration. So this is very, very basic practice, if you like. So what we have to learn to do in a number of different ways is gradually, by degrees, to take more and more responsibility for ourselves. And that means taking responsibility for what we say we will do. But that's just one example. We have to learn, for example, to take responsibility in other ways. Very often, for example, I've commented upon this before, but I think it's so ubiquitous in our society now. I think you can't really be reminded of it too much. Is that we must try to resist whatever temptation we feel to blaming others for our bad experiences of life. I mean, it may be that sometimes people behave badly towards us. Certainly they do, but it doesn't help us if we think, oh, I've been badly treated. Say at work or whatever situation you happen to find yourself in, even if you have been badly treated. Better from a Buddhist point of view, just simply to bear the sort of discomfort or the pain that it brings to you, whatever it is that troubles you, rather than dwelling upon such and such a person or such and such a group of people behaved badly towards me. Because if you think like that, if you dwell upon those kinds of thoughts, you probably find that it just encourages resentment. And if you dwell upon these sorts of thoughts too much, well, you might find that they're very difficult to dislodge in the longer term. You might find that you bear a grudge against somebody over a long period of time. This is the sort of thing that does actually happen. But in order to avoid doing that, just don't think like that. If you can just avoid thinking in terms of blaming. For starters, you'll have a much happier immediate experience of life, but it will help you to become a much more positive human being. So this is also part of the beginnings, if you like, of the spiritual life, the sort of path or the stage of integration. The second stage, which sort of leads on from this sort of thing really, is the stage of positive emotion. So in this stage we try to develop, of course, positive emotions. We try to develop skillful intentions. We try to act skillfully. It covers the whole area of the ethical, the whole of ethical practice in the early stages of our practice of the Dharma. So this is what this means, this stage of positive emotion. We actually go out of our way to try to develop positive emotions and dwell in those positive emotions. Hence, of course, we do the Metta-bhavana practice, which I'm assuming that all of you will be familiar with and will have practiced on a number of occasions. It's a very, very beautiful practice. It's a very effective one, but you do have to be patient with it. At least that's been my experience. It does work, as I've said on many occasions. I've been doing it for 44 years, and I know that it's worked for me. So that's very much part of this second stage of the spiritual path, the development of positive emotions. But there's another dimension to this which I should mention, which is that it's, well, yes, we can all do that, but we can also try to create for ourselves the most supportive conditions for the arising of positive emotions, for the strengthening of positive emotions. And this is one reason why we recommend so constantly to you that you go away on a retreat. Because when you go on a retreat, you experience the most supportive conditions for developing and maintaining positive mental states, positive emotions. And this comes about in a number of ways. It's not just a question of doing the Metabhavana practice, wonderful though that is, and the effects of which are equally wonderful. It's not just that. It's a question of interacting with other people who themselves are trying to develop positive emotions, or perhaps who to some degree actually embody positive emotions, or let's say they're in an emotionally positive state most of the time, or much of the time. So the more that you mix with people like that, the more you're likely to experience positive emotion yourself, strengthen the positive emotion within yourself, which is, of course, one of the reasons why we stress the importance of the development of what we call spiritual friendship. I'm not going to say much about that this evening, not now. I mean, we can come back to it if you wish when we get to questions, but it's another example of that, how you develop positive emotions. And on this note, since this coming Wednesday, which is only 2 days from now, we have an arts event at the London Buddhist Arts Centre down the road, not too far from here, with Michael Longley coming here. There is another opportunity of developing positive emotion, developing your appreciation for the fine arts in whatsoever way, whether it's poetry or art, painting and so forth, or any of the fine arts. These two can help to develop and even to refine positive emotions, and it's a very, very important part of our Buddhist lives, and one which I'm sure many of you will be aware we really, really stress and emphasize. Less than a couple of weeks ago, I went to a concert at the Wigmore Hall, which I do occasionally, and it was a youngish Czech string quartet playing, and they played a Shostakovich string quartet, number 2, as it happens, for those who are familiar with it, which I'd heard played before. And they played it with such energy, such verve, it completely blew me away. And in the second half, it was even better because they were playing one of my favourite pieces of music, which was Schubert's String Quintet. Now, at the end of that evening, I felt I was on cloud 9. It was just such a wonderful evening. And it was as if I was in a jhanic state. So even appreciating music, beautiful music like that, can lift us into a more positive emotional state. Presumably that's why people go to concerts. They know that it brings them, that it stimulates something which they can't easily access within themselves. It's there within all of us. But we need stimulus, we need stimulation. And as I mentioned a few moments ago, Kalyana Mitrata is one way in which you can bring that about. But also going to theatre, depending on what you see, of course, going to a concert, depending on what the music is, etc., etc. These can all have that sort of impact. So this is a very, very important stage, the development of positive emotion. So these first 2 stages, they're pretty basic. They're the foundational practice, really. And they form the foundation for what comes next. Of course, it's a progressive path we're talking about, which is spiritual death. Perhaps doesn't sound quite so positive to some of you, but it's a very, very important stage to reach and to traverse and to practice and to deepen. Now, when you reach this stage, this is equivalent in our own scheme of things to actually committing yourself to the Buddhist life. to entering our order, our spiritual community. So by the time that you reach this stage, or by the time we reach this stage, those of us who are ordained, we should have some awareness of and feel for the fact that, ultimately there is no such thing as a fixed, unchanging self. It's not just that we intellectually accept that and can see that, but the analysis, the Buddhist, it's not just that we see that the Buddhist analysis of this makes sense. It actually begins subtly, by degrees, to affect the way that we behave. And putting it, I was going to say in more positive terms, well, in a way it's putting it in negative positive terms. It means that you do by degrees begin to act, less selfishly, more selflessly, by degrees. And so this is the main thrust, if you like, of that third stage, so that you strengthen your understanding, or you deepen your understanding of the fact that there is no such thing as a fixed, unchanging self. And that understanding, therefore, undercuts the clinging that we all experience to who we are, to our identity. Because ultimately, we've got no choice. We have to let go of that identity, whether we like it or not, because one day, and that day is probably closer for me than any of you, because I'm older than all of you, as far as I can tell, you're going to have to let go of it completely, because you're going to die. I'm going to die. It might not be that too far into the future. My father died when he was 69, and I'm 68, and I'm very conscious of that. And so another thing that we can do, that we're encouraged to do, is to reflect upon this sort of thing, to reflect upon the fact that, death is certain, but you never know when it's going to happen. Actually, that's true for any of us, but it's just, death could just be around the corner. Now, this is not being morbid, it's just being realistic. You just don't know when you're going to die, but you do know that you will die. And so we begin to reflect on these sorts of things, and they become more and more real for you, believe me, when you get older. I've had a number of scrapes with death in the course of my life. In fact, I'm lucky still to be here. I should have been killed when I was 32. I suffered an accident which should have killed me, and I walked away from it. I didn't suffer any serious injury. But the first two people who got to me expected to find a corpse, and they were astonished that I was alive. I didn't even lose consciousness. I won't describe what happened. It was the fault of the wind. I was in Boston, in the United States, in Massachusetts, when it happened. But I do not understand why I survived that particular accident. But it certainly sent I'm not quite sure how you'd put it, a kind of thrill of horror and realization through me for the subsequent weeks. I was basically I was knocked down by a huge fence in a gale, right up to there, and my head went like that against a concrete sidewalk, and I didn't even lose consciousness. I think I must have a concrete skull and a concrete spine, frankly. But the impact of that event upon me was to, first of all, just not trust fences anymore. I was very careful when I was walking anywhere down the street where there's a large fence. It's just double latticed. It was 2 meters high. It was very, very big, very heavy. It took 4 people to lift it off me. But when you have experiences like that in life, you realize just how fragile your own life is. I still marvel when I think about how on earth did I get up and walk away from that. I was on my way to work, illegally I must say, but which is why I told the ambulance people to go away, quite apart from the fact I couldn't afford the $100 it was going to cost me to go to the hospital. But the journalist, one or two people who came to my aid, who was a woman journalist, said, "Look, where are you going?" And I told her, I said, I've got a job to go to. She said, "Okay, well, I'll give you a lift there." But she took me straight to hospital. She duped me. Anyway, I'm sort of getting distracted from my main purpose. But when you have experiences like that in life, you really do realise just how fragile it is, just how quickly, unexpectedly, you could lose it. And I think experiences like that are very, very positive. And if you do ever have these kind of experiences, and I'm not wishing them upon anybody, but if you do, it's very, very helpful then just to dwell upon, just to allow yourself to just reflect upon just how fragile your own life is. However, in order to do that, you need a definite basis. You need a positive basis. You need a basis of positive emotion, which is why this stage of spiritual death is the third stage, not the first stage or even the second stage. You need that basis of positive emotion. Because if you start reflecting too soon on these sorts of things, well, it might have the wrong sort of impact upon you. There's a very, very famous occasion in the life of the Buddha where he, unfortunately, misjudged a group of his own disciples. He left them to, it was a group of monks, I can't remember how many, but he left them to contemplate death and impermanence. And when he came back sometime later, they'd all committed suicide, which was not the point. So even the Buddha can make mistakes, but it sort of underscores, if you like, the fact that you do need to be in a positive mental state if you're going to be engaging in these kinds of reflections. You do need a basis of positive emotion, because without that, you may find that you get depressed, or ultimately it's counterproductive. So if you engage in these kind of reflections, then remember, metta is important. In fact, when we do these kind of meditation practices which are associated with this kind of reflection, we usually precede them by doing the metta bhavana, just to make sure that we are in an emotionally positive state, and therefore also in a more receptive state, so that we can benefit from the reflections that we're engaging in. So this gives you a flavour, at least, of the stage of spiritual death. It means going beyond our self-clinging, or trying more and more to go beyond our self-clinging, trying not to be so governed by our personal likes and dislikes. In fact, trying to see that engaging in selfless activities leads to a more rewarding and fulfilled life. The more, in a sense, you're able to forget about yourself, bearing in mind what I just said, the more happy you will be. That certainly has been my experience. So what this stage sees is the slow emergence of what we might call sort of selfless activity, and selfless, genuinely selfless motivations. So that's the stage of spiritual death. In the fourth stage, which is the stage of spiritual rebirth, these sort of non-egoistic motives become strengthened and gather more and more momentum, so that you become characterized more and more by selfless activity. In other words, you've reached a certain degree of spiritual momentum from which you cannot fall back, and which ultimately carries you to the fifth stage, which is the stage of no more effort. You'll be glad to hear there is such a stage. That's the good news. The bad news is its equivalent to enlightenment, which is a long way off for most of us. But you can get there. And this is the way we go about it. So the fifth stage is the stage of no effort, or spontaneous, compassionate activity. So that's a rough sketch of the spiritual path or the stages of the spiritual path as Sangharakshita has sort of adopted them, except he does not speak in terms of this fifth stage. He does not speak of it in terms of spontaneous, compassionate activity. That's not quite part of his scheme, but the other four stages are. There is a sort of intermediary stage which has become associated with a meditation practice that some of you may be familiar with, which we call just sitting, although in the early days of our movement, Sangharakshita said, no, just sitting is not a meditation practice. It simply means you just sit. You don't make an effort, you just sit. You don't make an effort not to make an effort, you just sit and you just experience whatever's there. And this is the stage identified with the stage of spiritual receptivity. And if we're going to look at it at the stages of the path in this way, well, that would sort of probably come in between the positive emotion and the spiritual death. Okay, that gives you a broad outline of the stages of the spiritual path. So now is the time for you to put any questions you might have about these matters to me. Yes.
How long does it take to get integrated?
How long's a piece of string? Depends how much effort you make. Well, in a way, it's an ongoing process. There's the process of psychological integration, which it would depend how psychologically healthy you are, how emotionally positive you are, and so forth. Some people seem to never really bring it about, but then they would not necessarily be making an effort. I mean, with many people, it might be a process which will happen quite naturally as they get older, but it doesn't always happen. It's not necessarily an automatic process. I would say that if you are seriously engaging with meditation practice, you maintain a regular meditation practice, well, I would expect that you would quite naturally become more aware of yourself, who you are, including all those bits you don't want to admit into your consciousness, because we've all got them, we've all got our little secrets, and we try to sometimes even hide our little secrets from ourselves, but actually you can't, especially if you sit down and meditate, because whatever's in the mind will surface sooner or later. So it depends on so many different factors. But if you make a consistent effort, you practice meditation regularly, then hopefully it won't take too long. But it's a continuous process. There are levels and levels of this. We're in a sense, you're never completely off the path of integration. It's something which happens at deeper and deeper, or if you like, higher and higher levels. Does that answer the question? It does. Okay. I sometimes get the questions wrong. Yep.
Why does the stage of spiritual receptivity come in between positive emotion and spiritual death?
Well, you're just open to the. I suppose it means being open to absorbing the fact that ultimately there is no such thing as a permanent fixed self. I mean, it's something that we experience a lot of emotional resistance to. Because in a way it seems to contradict our experience, because you've always been there throughout this life anyway. You don't know where you came from, but you're still you, and you've always been you for as long as you can remember. So why should that why should that just not continue? For example, that's one way of looking at why it is that we may not do that. But spiritual receptivity needs to come after, as I said, positive emotion. And that's the sort of thing that you'd be looking at. But spiritual receptivity, again, is something that you're not necessarily going to be just engaging in at the third stage of the path. It's something that has to be constant throughout the whole of your spiritual life. So that all of these 5 stages, well, you can use them as you can look at them as a kind of progression, but they're also what's the term? They're all at the same concurrent. We should be engaging in them. We're practicing them concurrently too. But does that answer your question about why there? But actually, it occurs at all stages. Yes.
Okay, so I just ask for example. Okay, so I've just explained. I'm going to go through a divorce at the moment. Yeah.
So you're going to do
divorce. Yeah.
Oh right, yeah.
Okay, so and we're sort of trying to work out sharing out a flat that I've paid for, and stuff. And it's very, very hard to let go of feelings of resentment,
yes.
like that in that situation.
Yes.
But also, it's like how I can sort of see that I could manage to do that, but then how could you, at the time you're doing that, also try to defend your corner? When you feel like morally that you could be really being.
Yeah.
How do you sort of
Yeah.
defend that position.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we should just let others walk all over us. Not that I'm saying that that's what your partner's doing with you, by the way, but it's sort of, you do, of course, have to, you can't just ignore your own, what is your due, if you like, I suppose. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you blame the other person for that experience, it doesn't ultimately help you. I think it's perfectly understandable that in the circumstances that you find yourself in at the moment, that you should feel resentment. But at such a stage, all you can do is just try to be aware of that, but try not to indulge it, because ultimately it won't help you. Because, well, the Buddha himself says, in fact, in the very first chapter of the Dhammapada, that he says this: he who thinks he abused me, he beat me, he robbed me, will not still his hatred. In other words, won't pacify his hatred. So if you think in those terms, which are, of course, the terms that we habitually tend to think in, it doesn't help us, and it certainly doesn't help the other person. Not to think in those terms about them anyway. This is not to deny that sometimes, that perhaps someone's behaved very, very badly towards us. But if you think towards them in that kind of way, it will not help you to get over your resentment, your hatred, or whatever. Yeah? So it's just, if you like, it's a strategy for dealing with your own hatred, because it's in all of us, and resentment is a relatively mild manifestation of hatred. But it's so easy to think, to experience and to feel. So that's the point, really. Yeah?
There is an assumption there that the hatred is wrong somehow, isn't there?
That the hatred is wrong?
Yeah.
Well, yes, there is. Well, because we're trying to overcome it. It's not that it's wrong. I wouldn't describe hatred in those terms, but it's, in traditional terms, of course, it's unskillful. It's something, if we indulge, it will not help us, and it certainly won't help other beings either. This does not mean that that one shouldn't recognise where, for example, there is oppression. I mean, like real oppression, like, for example, the Dalits in India have suffered for not just for decades or centuries, but for millennia, because they are outside the caste system. And they're confined to a certain kind of, well, traditionally they're confined to performing certain duties. They cannot ever rise above the stigma of the caste that they were born into. To be born under such a system as, if you're familiar with Dr. Ambedkar, who we were celebrating the other day, to be born into such a system as that, to be born certainly as an untouchable, as he was, to be what we call a member of the Dalit community, he described it as a system worse than slavery. So you would recognise that and you would try to change it for the better. And we are actively engaged in doing that through our own movement in India. But to do that on the basis of hatred will be counterproductive. And I think this is, for example, one reason why Ambedkar is such a huge figure, such a great figure, one of the great heroes of the last century. He effected, or began to effect, a social change and a revolution entirely peacefully. And I don't know if any of you saw the film the other evening of his life that we showed on Saturday evening, but there's a scene in there which sort of represents the man in a very, very sort of moving kind of way. He's rebuking one of his followers, I think, or a group of his followers, and he makes the point. He said, "I do not hate Brahmins, I hate Brahmanism." And he said on another occasion in one of his writings that he was a man who was strong in his hatreds. But, he said, my hatreds are never personal. He said, I hate oppression. I hate hypocrisy. I hate posturing. So, yes, if there is genuine oppression, you have to resist that. You have to try to bring about changes to positive changes, but not on the basis of hatred or resentment.
So there's a distinction between hating a person and hating a concept.
Well, he was making that distinction himself. Yes, I mean he was saying it he was saying it in a context of where some of his followers clearly were in danger of engaging in hatred which was more personalised, which was actually hatred of Brahmins, the people themselves. And that might, given what they suffered under the caste system, that might be perfectly understandable. But in the end, it doesn't help. And Dr. Ambedkar could see that very clearly. And so he tried to discourage those sorts of attitudes, or indulging in those kinds of attitudes.
Do we not personify concept when we hate it? And isn't that doesn't that make us fall into the same trap?
Well, presumably it could do. If you hate a particular ideology, well, presumably you could fall victim to hating those who you see as embodying that. But clearly Dr. Ambedkar did not do that. But you see, bear in mind, it was a particular context he made that remark in. I think it is something you've got to be careful about, actually. Pamadara, you've been trying to say something for a while.
I just got very moved by a comment earlier, and just reflecting on something that helps my meditation practice, and that's that it seems very important to experience the difficult emotion, not to feed it, but to experience it.
Yeah.
Because sometimes we come along here and we're looking for a path out of suffering,
Yeah.
even if we don't frame it that way.
Yeah.
And if one suppresses the difficult feelings, in a way it's hard to transform them.
Yeah.
And the danger is, spiritual bypass. I don't know if you've discussed that, but I just thought we were mentioning that, because that becomes the edge of our meditation practice. It's out of that energy that the lotus grows.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you have to experience what's there in your mind, but that's different from indulging it or giving expression to it. That's true for all of us, because we're all subjected in varying degrees to the three poisons of greed, hatred and delusion. And we have to try to work against them and rise above them. And we can, because through the practice of the Dharma. But they have to be experienced if they're there. You can't brush them under the carpet. And that applies to any difficult aspects of our personality that's there. I mean, things that you don't like about yourself. Well, it's what you are. It's who you are. You have to acknowledge them. Let them into consciousness and then work with them, whether they're innocent or things which need to be actually worked with and overcome. Yes?
I mean, on this topic about hatred, blame, and just maybe I suppose it's been covered, but for it to be met with metta, with kindness, and also is it related to the fact that we want a particular experience? It's like I want he or she should be like this, and they're not. So you want to change something that's just like the way it is, I guess you can't really change.
Well, perhaps you're trying to change something which is beyond your control, because other people are. You can't change them; they can only change themselves. But what I was trying to get across is that you may not feel that you can respond to, let's say, bad treatment, if indeed anyone has been bad treated, with metta. That's just expecting too much of yourself. But at least try not to adopt an attitude of blame towards those who you identify as being the sources of your own suffering. They may or may not be. And ultimately, according to the Buddha, we have to take full responsibility for our own experience of life. And that's something which we often find very, very difficult to do. Yeah?
Also, just offer my take on this, and it is that if somebody causes you pain, that's something which I guess you to some extent kind of avoid feeling. It's an energy that they pass to you, and you have to deal with that. You absolutely need to breathe through it and let it do whatever it does to your body, right? The problem is the minute you start hating someone or resenting someone, you're effectively allowing them to consume your own energy. Like you're allowing them to be inside your life, inside your mind for much longer than they deserve to be.
Yeah.
And in the end of the day, the person who's losing is you. So, as hard as it may be, I guess the approach that I would have is to try to leave that person where they are, because obviously, well, the way that I end up thinking about it is trying to forgive them maybe to some extent.
Yeah.
They have, just like you do, you have they have the potential for good and for evil.
Yeah.
And just
Yeah.
let them be.
Yeah, well, I think forgiveness is very important, at least within your own mind. To forgive them within your own mind. I mean, if they don't, I mean, sometimes when people are unwilling to even acknowledge that they have behaved badly, it's difficult actually to forgive them for that. But at least try to adopt an attitude of forgiveness, because it is one way which will help you to get beyond your ill will, whatever it is. And that's what really we have to try to overcome. Yes, at the back there.
I just find it very useful to always remember that myself and anyone else who's trying to avoid suffering and the causes of suffering, so no matter what comes my way, I always understand that they're, in whatever way it's happening, they're trying to avoid suffering.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's a universal impulse, not just a universal human impulse, but you can see it in animals, at least insofar as they want to avoid pain, just like we do. They don't want pain. No living thing wants pain, and what they want is freedom from pain, and especially happiness. That is a universal impulse.
So no matter what's happening, no matter what they're pointing in my direction, I know it comes from the root that they want to be free from suffering. So it helps me to understand others' behaviour towards me.
Yeah. Well, very often people think that they can gain happiness by inflicting pain upon others, or that by inflicting pain upon others, it won't cause them pain. It's a means of gaining happiness, but it just doesn't work like that. Yeah.
Sorry, another thing I wanted to ask is, how does all of this relate to, I know it sounds extreme, but everything that's happening around the world? So,
Okay, there's some horrible things happening in the world. How do we relate to that?
Yeah, I know, but I mean, I was reading something in The Guardian, survived, whose wife had died in the shooting in Bataclan, I think it was last year in Paris.
Mm-hmm.
He said he really didn't hate the attackers, and that's obviously a lot of courage there. But those are that's obviously a very extreme example. But I'm just trying to think. I mean, I know you can obviously meet them, and you can see it as. Yeah. But it's just.
How do you do that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, not just that, but everything else that's happening is just like.
Well, I think there are two things you can do. First of all, try to adopt as positive an attitude, as positive an emotional attitude that you can to, all the suffering that you encounter or that you see or that you hear about. That's one thing. Another thing is that you can take definite actions to try to improve things for others. And that's one reason why I'm a member of the Triratna Buddhist order, because I feel that by working within this movement, as I have done most of my life from the age of 24, that I'm having a positive impact upon the world, because I believe in the positive values of Buddhism, and especially as taught by Sangharakshita, my teacher. And part of that for me has involved spending quite a bit of time in India working there, teaching especially people from, mainly people from the Dalit background, the untouchable, ex-untouchable community, and helping them to lead a more dignified and happy and even dharmic life. So I feel that that's been a route for me, and it's been very important, I must say, to feel that I have some impact upon bringing about some positive change in the world. Of course, there's a limit to what any one person can do unless you really are an exceptional human being, like Dr. Ambedkar, who was, in my view, an extraordinary man, and the founder of this movement, Sangharakshita. I'd single out both of them. They have both they've both had a huge impact, positive impact upon the lives of many, many people. Ultimately, millions of people in India. So if I can be part of something like that myself, play my own small part in that, well, I feel that's something I can do. I can't do more than that. We've all got specific talents, we've all got limitations. You have to work with them, but everybody can contribute something positive. We'll all do it in different ways, but you have to try, and I mean, for me, I couldn't lead a Buddhist life unless I felt that I was having a positive impact, some kind of positive impact on the lives of others. Helping to benefit others is very much part of one's Buddhist practice. Of course, the corollary of that is that I have to work on my mental states and try to overcome my inclination towards greed, hatred and delusion, because it's still there. It's still alive and kicking in me, I can tell you. I'm not proud of it, but it's a fact. But I'm working on it. It's a work in progress. It's a long work in progress.
It feels like the more you try to help, from my experience, the greater that those emotions exist within me, where I do kind of hatred begins to play a part. In a world where, say, political aims are quite ambivalent, but human suffering isn't, it's hard not to grow hatred, feeling of hatred.
Yeah.
And it's kind of sparks quite negative emotions, so you sort of spend all this time working on yourself, trying to be positive, and then, for example, I went to the West Bank last year and did some charity work there, and found I came back so confused and full of hatred.
Right.
And, how can this exist?
Well, I think that you have to be, I think part of the process is becoming aware of your own particular, your strengths and your weaknesses, but also making sure that you are in positive, supportive conditions. When I go to India, that doesn't happen to me because I'm in very, very supportive conditions. We have many centres like this one, not quite as plush as this one, but we've got centres all over central India especially, but in many parts of India now, where there are supportive conditions like those that you yourselves will experience when you walk in here. So that's vitally important. You need that kind of support. But if you're mixing with people who perhaps are trying to cope with a very difficult situation, but not from a basis of positive emotion, you may well find that you come back from such a situation hating and resenting those who you see as responsible for those people's suffering. And it's very tricky. But I think that you just have to find the right context. And know your own limitations. Don't be afraid to acknowledge, I can't do this unless I have a certain basis of positive, if there are positive and supportive conditions in place so I can function in a positive way, in an emotionally positive way. So that's what you've got to do. But I think something else that you can do, and this is quite practical, is that it can be so upsetting when you watch the news on television, night after night after night, or read it on the internet or whatever. I don't do it because I know that I'll just get stirred up. I can't do anything about it. I'm impotent to most of it. I can't do more than I'm already doing. I don't feel. I'm doing my best to try to improve the world in my own little way, but the problems of the world are so huge. It's so easy to get overwhelmed by them and start to feel hatred and resentment towards those who, rightly or wrongly, are identified as being the sources of the sufferings of others. But actually, when it comes down to it, in the end, we all are the agents of suffering to other people. We may not wish to be, and it may not be in such gross ways as sometimes you read about in newspapers or see on the news and television, but actually we all cause suffering to one another. It's part of the human condition, I'm afraid. And we have to learn, of course, to recognise that in ourselves, the pain that we cause to others, and try to limit that, try to limit it more and more so that you don't. It's a long process. But I can't emphasise too much the importance of supportive, positive conditions. And there's another dimension to this as well, which I don't have time to go into now, but just to say that if you want to help to change the world for the better, there needs to be wisdom too. You need to be able to see clearly what is really going to help other people, what will most help them. not something which is just going to act as a kind of temporary palliative. Useful though that may be sometimes, but we need more radical solutions than that. And that's why I'm a Buddhist, because Buddhism is a radical tradition and it offers radical solutions. And it means that there has to be an element of wisdom present. And that has to, it can only arise in connection with positive emotion, actually. But that's a whole other discourse. We've got a few minutes before we have to stop. Anyone ask? Yes?
When can you call yourself or refer to yourself as a Buddhist?
So when? You can call yourself a Buddhist, presumably if you feel sympathy with Buddhism. Many people do. But from meaningfully, I think that to be a Buddhist means to commit yourself to Buddhist ideals in some degree or other, so that you consciously, deliberately incorporate those ideals into your life, and they assume more and more importance to you, so that you'll live your life more and more from those ideals. But I suppose in principle, if you feel that you resonate with the values of Buddhism, they're important to you, that you would like to live your life more and more in accordance with that, well, why not call yourself a Buddhist? It's up to you in a way. But strictly speaking, what makes you a Buddhist is when you really do fully commit yourself to those ideals. Looks like that's it, folks. Please come back next week. I won't be here. I will be in the building, but I'm leading a 6-week introductory course to Buddhism and meditation next door. I have no idea who's leading the class next week, but it certainly won't be me. But I hope to see you once more when I come up when that course is finished. Thank you.